Visual regression testing with BackstopJS. My name is David Needham. I'm happy to be here to share a little bit about what I know about visual regression testing. Before I get started though, I'd like to just start by saying that this is not meant to be an exhaustive representation of everything that you can do with visual regression. I don't even claim to be an expert of BackstopJS. I simply have a passion for sharing things that I learned that helped me get started with tools at the very beginning. So kind of getting your feet wet, showing that it's not that difficult to try to run on your own so that you can play with it and learn and grow from there. So that's the perspective that we're coming from today. So my name is David Needham. I'm a developer advocate at Pantheon. I like to say that I sit between the developers that build Pantheon and the developers out in the community that use Pantheon. So I take everything that I learned at Pantheon, teach it to the community, take everything that I learned by being in the community back to Pantheon so that we're making good decisions about features and functionality and all of that fun stuff. As a result of me being in this position of living between developers in different locations, living between developers at agencies and developers doing all sorts of different technologies, I end up working with a pretty wide array, a varied number of libraries and techniques and strategies. And so I'm happy to share a little bit of what I've learned about visual regression testing and specifically BackstopJS. All right, so this topic, this session that we're talking about today is actually based on a class that we've done. We've actually done a workshop that is a full day or a half day, or a 1.5 hour long session. And I have kept the slides more or less as they are. So we're going to be going through some of these slides pretty quickly, but I wanted to keep them this way because we have all of our exercises in these slides. And if you go get the slides, you'll be able to go through all of these exercises on your own time as well. So it's visual-regression.davidneedham.me. Will get you directly to these slides so you can interact with them directly. I don't think you'll be able to follow along with the exercises necessarily, but if you pay attention to the slides or pay attention to the presentation, I'll go through them pretty quickly and then you'll be able to do it on your own time later on. Also, thanks to Kevin Thal, this is being recorded, so this video will show up on my website, davidneedham.me, so you'll be able to watch the video as many times as you'd like after today. All right, so there's a bunch of stuff that you need to get started, mostly Node and NPM. You might already have that if you're already doing other things with Node. You need to install Backstop. In this case, we're installing it globally, so we can run Backstop from whatever project that we're using it on. You can also install Backstop on just a particular project if you don't want to do it globally. Either way is fine. And we will also be demonstrating a standalone Node app that one of my colleagues wrote, so that if you have a QA team that maybe doesn't want to install BackstopJS themselves or know how kind of the ins and outs of how it works themselves, they'll be able to run a single command to execute a visual regression test, which will help speed things up for them a little bit, make it a lower barrier to entry for anyone to get started with. We'll be taking a look at that app later on as well, and you'll have links to be able to download and modify that. Also, I do have a live version of a website and a development version of a website. So up here in my browser, you can see I have pantheondemo.com, which is a Pantheon theater website that we use for a lot of demos at Pantheon. And I also have pantheon-weeklydemosite.lando.site. I'm using Lando for a local development environment. They should be identical. And in a few minutes, we'll be able to use visual regression testing to see if they're actually identical. All right, so with all the setup out of the way, let's keep moving. Let's learn a little bit first about what visual regression testing actually is. Maybe you've heard the phrase before. Maybe you've heard of automated testing. Maybe you attended my colleague Steve's session just right before this talking about automated testing. Well, today, let's start just by learning the basics of what visual regression specifically is and why you might be interested in that. So first, if we define regression, you're thinking about a return to a former or less developed state. So you built a project, you launched it, you're very happy with it, jump ahead, something broke. You make some sort of a change, and now something isn't working anymore. That's a regression. You've went back from this completed state to something that's less than complete. In what cases have you been plagued with visual regression? Well, I can share some of my own stories. I have certainly had visual regression happen when I'm doing security updates. In the Drupal community, you have updates that come out about every Wednesday or so. Most of the time, if you're doing a security update for your site, you don't expect anything visually to change. You're patching some sort of a security bug. Everything should look more or less the same before and after that update. And sometimes, if it's been a while since you've done updates on your site, something might break. Well, that might cause a visual regression. Something might visually look different. Also, when it comes to theming and site building over time, particularly with theming, we'll take a look at an example later, like how many times have you made a little change and it affected more than you expected? Well, using visual regression testing, we'll be able to test for those things. All right, so I have some screenshots here and some GIFs that kind of showcase how this might be represented with doing routine updates, with security updates. This is a WordPress website. Don't hold it against me. We work with both Drupal and WordPress on a regular basis, and it's a perfect example for both use cases. So in this case, we do have updates available. We click to apply the updates. So we go to our live site. We kind of refresh our memory what the live site looks like. We kind of scroll through it, remind ourselves, like, okay, this is how it looks. We then go over to our dev environment, whether it's local or in a staging site. We scroll through it. We look at it. Did anyone notice the thing that changed on the page? No. It is incredibly difficult for humans to catch very minor visual differences, especially if you are testing not just one page to the other, but what if you have to test multiple pages? What if you have to test multiple viewports, mobile versus desktop versus whatever? So even if we set up a script to set them up side by side so they both scroll automatically, I know what I'm looking for, so I caught it this time, but it's very subtle, right? It's very difficult to just, if you're flipping through, to catch what the difference might be. And then yes, if you're using, if mobile is important, you're going to want to check for mobile as well to make sure that it's not breaking something visually. Well, using visual regression testing, we have the ability to use machines, computers. I don't know if I'd say like AI necessarily, but you can use a computer to compare two screenshots and highlight the things that are different between them. So many times you're comparing a live version of a website versus a development version of a website. The machine will compare the two, and then you see we have that sort of colored variation showing what has changed between them. So we're using machine vision. It's much, much better than human vision at catching differences like this. It's also pretty easy to create. You'll see as we get started with BackstopJS, it's not difficult at all to create a test. It's not difficult to define additional pages or change breakpoints or anything like that. And the test is relatively quick. You'll see that as well when we get to the demo section. In this case, we are using BackstopJS, but that's one of many options for visual regression testing. You can do a Google search and you'll find many other options. You will also find third-party hosted solutions where you plug in the URLs and the service just does it for you. And there's often some sort of fee associated with that over time, but there's lots of options for using visual regression. So if we had used for that example earlier with that website, with the WordPress website and the update, we're using BackstopJS here. We get the little scrubber. We can see visually what's changed between the two. We can see that the search button went from just having the magnifying glass to also having the word search in there from just doing that update. It's much easier to see when we have the scrubber, but the test is able to return a pass-fail, so we can quickly see if it worked or it didn't, and then the highlight will kind of direct us to the point we should be looking at. All right, so I actually had, but before we move on, I actually had an example I want to share. It didn't happen this time because it was just a very perfect example. But last time I gave this presentation, it was actually a week ago at Flyover Camp down in Kansas City. The projectors in the room were terrible, absolutely terrible. These slides used to have a black background, and the text was either white or yellow, and basically it was impossible to read on those projectors. It just did not work at all. So at the last minute, after I plugged in and I saw it, I'm like, this isn't going to work, I did some quick CSS changes to swap it out, higher contrast with white background and black text, and slightly changing the font and all that stuff. And then I was like, oh man, like I'm comparing now like before and after. If only there was a way that I could tell if I'm catching everything, or if this is changing things unexpectedly on other slides. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm literally about to talk about visual regression testing. So I ran a visual regression test. I wish I had saved it so I can use that in a demo now, but I was able to catch like, oh, in a couple code examples I missed swapping out the CSS in that particular section. So I was able to catch that, and it was perfect. So you don't have to use visual regression testing just for, I'm building a website. You can use it for anything on a website, whether it's your website or even other people's websites. You want to see what changed from one version to the other? You can absolutely do that. All right, so taking a look at some benefits, you do get to compare a reference versus test. So it's assuming you have these two different versions. Typically, the reference is your production site, your live domain. The test is going to be whatever environment it is that you're working on, whether it's a staging server or your local environment. We do also add multiple viewports, whatever is important to you. The more tests you have, the longer it takes to run, but if it's important, then you should definitely test for it. It is also possible to scan your entire website. Like I just said, the more tests that you add, the longer it takes to run. However, if it is important to you that every single page on your site is tested, there is a Backstop crawl extension or plugin that you can get that will write the test file for you after kind of spidering, scanning your entire site so it knows all the pages. If you are doing that, I would probably discourage you from doing that because it will take a lot longer for the test to run. But if it's important that you test all the variations on your pages that you have, I recommend taking a sort of a snapshot of the ideal versions of each of your content types. If you have a blog post, if you have a biography page, if you have a product page, kind of pick one, maybe even two of those perfect examples, and then test those instead of testing every single, dozens or hundreds of pages at once. It is very helpful for error reporting. You'll be able to catch errors if you're scanning between the two, and it does provide you with some pretty good support in from the command line when you run this if there's some sort of an error detected. And again, it is very easy to write these tests. There are some limits to visual regression. It's not perfect. In fact, there is a lot of noise. So as you're going through, you might recall the kind of side-by-side screenshot I showed you, or the GIF I showed you before when we're doing this right here. You might have noticed, even though nothing in the header area changed, there's a whole bunch of noise up here. I think something changed in that header image, even though nothing really changed. This happens a lot when you're working with slideshows, for example. Sometimes the slideshow doesn't load at exactly the same time, and so as a result, it will sometimes say that there's a difference even though there's no difference. We'll probably see that in the demo that I'll be showing in just a minute. Also, sometimes things are just different and you don't know why. They don't look different to you. It says it's different. There are ways to mitigate that. We'll be telling it to ignore certain sections of our test. Another thing to keep in mind is if things are actively changing on the live version of the website, people are adding new content. If you have views that are constantly updating, refreshing with new things on the site, if you have a Twitter widget that's constantly updating with new streams, those are all going to cause the test to fail when you really don't care. And in those cases, we can't ignore those sections so that it doesn't infect the test. So there are a lot of false negatives that we really don't care about. Dynamic content is a pain. Ultimately, at the end of the day, visual regression testing is still worth it because it saves you a lot of time over manually just using your eyes to look yourself. All right, so let's start talking now about actually using BackstopJS. So BackstopJS you can go and grab from GitHub. We're able to use various render engines. Chromium or Puppeteer is kind of included by default, but there are a few others you can choose if you prefer not to use Chrome or anything like that. You can also simulate interactions meaning if you would like to cause a number of buttons to be clicked, if you want to get to the end of a web form to validate that the thank you page after the web form is still rendering properly, you can absolutely do that and set that up in advance. You can also provide cookies so that you can have a logged in experience if you want to test the logged in version of your site. So you can create a dynamic cookie that's shared, and it's able to use that to get into the admin interface. It does provide visual reports that you can view and click, and you saw the little scrubber that you can go back and forth on. But it also provides command line reports. So if you're including this as part of an automated test, you can have it pass, fail, progress to the next step in the test, or progress to the next part of the script, or not, as well as JUnit reports. The ways that we've used this at Pantheon, as far as like an automation step, involves using Circle CI, but really any continuous integration process could be set up to use BackstopJS pretty easily. And then I mentioned earlier we're installing this as global, so we can run this as part of any project that we have on our computer, but you could also set it up on just a singular project, or package it as part of a Node app and kind of run it from there. And ultimately, we're only going to be using 3 commands. We'll see it in just a minute, but we're going to use backstop init to initialize Backstop in a particular project. It generates the configuration file, and it puts the folders in place where it needs to go. We'll be using backstop reference to create the reference files, so kind of looking at the production site, creating screenshots of those so we have a representation of what we're looking at. And then backstop test, which looks at our development site, creates screenshots for that, and compares it to our existing reference files. And we'll take a look at those in just a moment. So I mentioned when we do backstop init, we end up with a backstop configuration. All of it is defined in your backstop.json file. If we take a look at this, it tries to be really readable, and after I was able to get into it and see and kind of tweak some of these variables, I found it pretty easy to work with. We can see here I've highlighted some of the sections that I'd like to talk about. At the very top, we have a section for viewports. Within viewports, you define the viewports that you want. You add a label, you add width and height, and it uses those to create individual reports for each page at each of these viewports. So if you care about any of these, if you want to change them, you can put in whatever you want. Below that, we define scenarios. And all that a scenario really needs are these 3 sections that I've highlighted. So we define a label. What is the URL? What is the page that we're actually testing? What is the actual URL? And what is the reference URL? Again, the reference is the live production site, the version that we're looking at as the perfect version, versus the URL, which is our development site. Below that, we're going to see all sorts of other options. For example, if you don't want the test to run until the page is ready or a particular element is loaded, you can do that. You can set a delay if things aren't quite loading at the same rate. You can also hide or remove things from the page completely. And when it refers to selectors, you could put any typical like class, ID, element, anything like that in there. And then there's a bunch of other stuff, and we're not going to be using the other stuff so much. A lot of this is described on the GitHub page, though. So if you'd like to do more advanced things with BackstopJS, it's pretty easy to dig in and extend it even more. All right, so let's actually get in and start playing with it. So I'm going to be doing this. Again, I don't expect anyone to necessarily have this ready to go, so you don't have to follow along. But if you're following along in the video in the future, feel free to pause and play and all that stuff and follow along if you'd like. So I've already installed BackstopJS globally. So now I'm going to navigate to my local project via the command line, and I'm going to run backstop init. So I've already done that. I have a folder here with my site in it. I'm going to do backstop init to initialize backstop in this project. Right now I'm going to use my local code editor to open this up and just show what is in the backstop.json file. All right, if I open up backstop.json, it looks pretty similar to the backstop.json that I showed you a little bit ago. There's some other stuff in here. So there's the viewports at the top where we define the ones that we care about seeing. There's this on ready and on before JS, where we can define other things in JavaScript that need to get set up before we're ready to get started. We also have the label, and it by default fills in the Backstop website. We have a section here for cookies. Again, if we want to do something with like logged in traffic or some sort of a session that's active, we could do that. Then we have the URL, the reference URL, and all of those other things. So if I want to get started, the example here, and I'm just going to follow it to keep it consistent, but we have a label. Let's go ahead and add a name for our site. For the label, I'm going to choose the Pantheon Theater homepage. And then for the URL is going to be the local or development URL. That's my Lando URL, so I'm going to grab that from my Lando site, which is my local environment. Paste that in. I'm going to go back, and I want to grab now my reference URL, which is my production site. So that's my pantheondemo.com. Put that in the reference URL section. And then I know from having done this before, Backstop init will kind of get some stuff set up for you in advance that we really don't care to demo at this moment. For example, this cookies information. If we leave it just as it is, we're going to get an error message. It's going to keep going through the test, but I'm just going to remove this line because it's not something we actually need for this example. Like I mentioned earlier, the only things that you really need for this scenario are these three lines: the label, the URL, and the reference URL. You could literally remove everything else in this section, and it would still run just fine. And then there's all this stuff up here: on ready script, on before script. Similar things we don't need because we're not using them for this example, so I'm going to remove them just to avoid any extra text in the test when it runs. And with that, I think we are ready to begin. So create a new reference screenshot by running backstop reference. So it is now going to our live site, taking a screenshot of both of the two viewports that I had defined. Some people have asked at this point about creating these reference screenshots. What if you commit these references as part of the project, like in the Git repository? That way you share them with other people on your team, and then they can refer to the same reference. So you're all testing against the same thing. That could absolutely work. I haven't used it like that in a real-world scenario before, but I don't see why not. All right, and then the next thing is step number 5. We're going to run the tests with backstop test. And it's actually very helpful in the command line here because it says, hey, you've generated your references. Now run backstop test to do the diff report. Backstop test, it's now going to my development site. It is creating screenshots at each of those two viewports. It's now generating the report and popping it up in my default browser. And as you can see, there is actually something has changed actually. This is, let me refresh real quick. So something has changed on the live site this time. On the live site, we have a bright red button here on our pantheondemo.com. And so our BackstopJS report actually caught that. It's funny because this is a live demo. That change happened since I tested it right before class. So that's okay, these things happen. We can keep moving, but so I was expecting these to be identical. I was not expecting to see a visual change. Something changed on the live site, that's okay. But also something unexpected did change. In mobile, in that smaller viewport, the screenshot or the slideshow at the top, it says there's something different between the two. And it looks like, by doing the scrubber, that it's just not fully loaded in either state. It might be like milliseconds apart from each other. And so as a result, it's not slightly transparent on one. It's hardly visible up on the projector. But what I'm going to try, actually, is going back to my backstop and maybe just setting a delay. So let's do maybe 800. This is in milliseconds. Let's try running it again. So we're going to regenerate our reference files because when we change our test, we want to regenerate the original ones that we're testing against because the parameters have changed. Creating new reference files from live. Okay, now we're going to do the test, which is going to create new new screenshots of our development site. Okay, perfect. So the slideshow at the top, there's no visual differences between that. It's fully loaded now, so that's great. The button on the side is still bad, and it's totally fine. Full disclosure, that's actually something we use for the Pantheon demo that we do every week. We quickly demonstrate a change in the Pantheon dashboard just by changing the color of the button. So that's fine. If we wanted to kind of match it up, I could probably just do a just a git checkout on the theme folder would probably be enough, I think. Checkout on okay, so now let me actually go back to my site, do a refresh. I'm expecting it to be red now, and it is not red. Okay, which makes me think maybe this version. Okay, well, hey, we can fix this anyway. If we go back to our site, go into the theme, go into the museum theme, change the CSS, we could make this red. We're going to make it match. We'll go back. In this case, we just changed our local environment. We didn't change the parameters of the test or anything like that. So we can actually just do a backstop test. We don't have to create new reference files because we don't expect anything changed on live. Again, we didn't change any of the parameters of the test. All right, and it looks like it passed. So at the top, you can see 2 tests passed, 0 failed. It thinks these 2 are identical now, which is great. Cool. All right, let's continue with the example. So killer use case number 2, the first one, as you recall, was doing security updates on your site. Use case number 2, theming and site building. How often has someone said, oh yeah, this will just be a quick fix. I'm just going to SSH in, or I'm just going to make this quick CSS change. And then hours later, you discover that it was a bigger thing. Who's done that before? Everyone, right? Pretty much. So that's why visual regression testing can also save the day and kind of save you a lot of time. So for that example that we just saw, if we're going through, if we wanted to change the specifications of the test, we're able to more accurately verify that whatever it is that we're changing is only affecting this change and not breaking other parts of our site along the way. So for example, let's just make some tweaks. Let's change this scenario a little bit. What if we want to change the viewports or the scenarios, the individual URLs that we're testing against? Well, let's give it a try. Maybe for this example, our marketing manager or someone says, oh man, yeah, that bright red button, not liking it. What if we made it match our color scheme a little bit? What if it was a yellow, like a Pantheon yellow or something like that? It's like, well, we can certainly try it. We'll go in and maybe we'll say, we don't have the hex code for the Pantheon yellow at the moment, so let's just try yellow, but it's probably really ugly yellow. Let's just try that. We'll do a refresh. Oof. Yeah, I think that's worse. Let me grab the Pantheon yellow real quick from the logo. Okay, jump back.
What tool is that?
It's a tool called Rulers. It lets you add bounding boxes or things to your screen, but also lets you grab colors real quick.
Cool.
Cool. So refresh. All right, a little bit better. Maybe if we make the text color black. Refresh. All right. So I mean, it could probably be improved even better, but I think this is a lot better than that bright red color, right? So what if we say, well, let's do a test. We're expecting to see a difference this time. Backstop test. And this is this is something that we expect, right? We're going to see a difference between the live site now and our local site. But we want to make sure that it's only the change that we're expecting. We want to make sure that it is not affecting another part of the page, or if we expand our test, we can test other pages as well to verify it's not breaking things there. So, yep, we can see this was the reference, this was the test. We can see the diff, it's that bright, obnoxious fuchsia pink color. I don't see anything else that is that pink color, so I think we're safe. Looks pretty good. Well, what if we wanted to make sure that maybe our login page is not broken as a result of this? We want to verify that that's working. Well, I know from experience our login page is pretty ugly already. We do have this button here, but we also have a button down there. Let's make sure that it's not negatively affected by this in an automated test. So we go into our example, our BackstopJS. We go down to the scenarios section. Remember, we do just need these 3 bits right here. So I'm going to grab part of this. I'm going to go down and create a new scenario. Like that. I'm going to say the Pantheon Theater user login, and we're going to say /user. So now we have 2 scenarios, the front page and now our login page. Maybe we also have decided that we don't really care about mobile at this point, and tablet is really a little narrow. So maybe we want to remove one of these tests or one of these viewports, and we just want a desktop. And maybe we say our ideal desktop range is 1600 by 940. Just going to throw something out there. Right, so because the parameters of our test changed, because we added viewports and scenarios, we need to create new reference files. So we'll do backstop reference. So it should be doing 2 URLs with 1 viewport. So I'm expecting, as it says, 2 of 2. All right, that completed. So now we'll do backstop test. All right, so yes, this is the front page on desktop. Looks fine to me. On the login page, it also looks fine. It looks like a poorly themed login page, but besides that, the only bright fuchsia pink color is on that login box, or on the call to action box. So it did only change that piece. It didn't break the login screen as far as I can tell. Yes, question?
Have you seen any references from this where it tells you how many diffs it found on a page?
The question was, have I seen any references to tracking like how many differences it finds on a page? No, I haven't. I think I haven't. I don't know if it's possible or not. I would expect it might have trouble because it's sort of like painting an area, and like especially if something like that example with like an image at the top, it's painting like bits and pieces, so you might get like hundreds of differences, or maybe just one if it's an entire area that's painted that color.
So it's just pixel differences? Is that what it's?
It is just checking pixel differences between 2 screenshots. Yep. All right, well, so let's keep going. So this was an example where we changed the viewports and the scenarios. We regenerated our reference file because our test parameters changed, and then we reran backstop test. If you're not changing the parameters of the test, if you're not expecting anything to be changing on live, you can just run backstop test over and over and over and over again, and it's always going to be checking your local versus those images that it created of the reference earlier. All right, so we only have a few more minutes, but let's talk briefly about automating this. Let's use some continuous integration process. So you can certainly, everything I've done up to this point is a manual process that you can just run on your computer. Even if the rest of your team isn't using BackstopJS, you can verify that what you're doing is not introducing regression, or use it for side projects or whatever you want. When it comes to continuous integration, you might include BackstopJS and visual regression testing to verify that something is not regressing before continuing to the next step. So for example, at Pantheon, we have a We have a command line tool called Terminus, and we have a script, an example script available that will fully automate the process of doing security updates. It checks for security updates as part of a continuous integration step. If there are updates found, it applies those updates into a branch. On Pantheon, we call them multi-dev environments. It will then do visual regression testing, performance testing, accessibility testing, and even BHAT testing. And if every test passes with 0 failures, 0 pixel differences between that development environment and the live site, it will actually create backups on our live site and test site, deploy it up to live. So fully hands-off, fully automated. By testing that extensively, we're able to increase our confidence such that we feel comfortable automating that process. Of course, it is just a script. You can modify it however you want, but I think it's a great example of automating the process with continuous integration. Ultimately, if you are currently doing QA manually and you're struggling through it, it can be good to think about what parts of your job you could use robots, computers to do, things that they're better at, faster at, more efficient at, that you could include as part of your workflow so that you don't have to do it manually anymore. So this was actually the example I got to a little bit early, but you can definitely go grab the script, take a look at it. It is currently anticipating that you're using Circle CI. It's anticipating that you're using Pantheon. You can take it, modify it. It's on GitHub, however you want. So it checks for updates on cron, generates the new environment, applies the updates, make backup, and then applies it and notifies you that it's done. The second example, so we actually ran a workshop, a full-day workshop at DrupalCon called Automated Workflows in Drupal 8 with GitHub, Composer, and Circle CI. With this particular class, we demonstrated a workflow where we added a module with Composer. I think it was the address module because it's a great place to get started. People use a lot. So on a Drupal 8 site, we added the address module with Composer. We pushed the branch that we had created for that up to GitHub and created a pull request. As part of that, the build ran automatically with Circle CI. It compiled the site with Composer, pulled in all the dependencies, kind of tested it, built it, and placed this perfect version over on Pantheon, pre-built, tested, and all that stuff ready to go. And the visual regression test and all the other tests appeared in the pull request automatically. So all that the developer had to do, use Composer, make the pull request, all the testing happened automatically, and it shows up for their lead developer or their project manager or whomever to verify that the things changed that they're expecting to change. If this is something that's interesting to you, I'm expecting we'll probably do this class sometime again, and we are right now talking about doing this as either a short webinar series, like maybe 3 one-hour chunks, or maybe a single 3-hour training that we would do online. If you're interested, maybe come up to me afterwards or shoot me an email or something. Let me know. We'll get you on the list for that. It's not something we charge for, so if you'd like to learn more about this process, let us know. Okay, and then finally the standalone app. So I don't have time to go through this right now, unfortunately, but let me just talk about what it would look like. So the scenario, again, is that you have a QA team, you have someone who doesn't feel comfortable running BackstopJS themselves or configuring the YAML file. You can give them a Node app that's kind of set up, pre-configured for your project, so that every time that you run, Node run start or whatever, npm run start or whatever it might be that you run, or as part of another operation, maybe you put a button on their desktop and they click the button and it runs the test automatically and it just pops up in their browser and they have a test that just ran because they fired it off. So all of these examples are here. You can go download the examples, run them on your own, check it out, see if you like it. The examples include the first one, which is it's just a site and you run it and it runs and it's done. And then there's a multiple site example where you run it and it asks you which of these 3 or 4 sites would you like to test. You choose the one you want and then it goes and tests it. And then you can run all of them if you want. But cool. So any questions? Yes?
Do you ignore parts of the import?
Yeah, so I was so in the many times that I've run this session and workshop, that slideshow at the top gives me varying degrees of difficulty, and I can't consistently figure out how to fix it every single time. I was fortunate this time that simply setting the delay was enough. I was able to say, wait this long and then take a screenshot, and then it doesn't catch it anymore. Occasionally, I'll have to remove it or hide it. So for example, let me just do that real quick, and we'll all see how that works. So here, back in my backstop.json file, we have the section for
Hide selectors?
yes, thank you, right here, hide selectors. So if we just put in a selector, maybe I think flex slider is the flex slider. So we put in hide selectors like this, and we go back. We're going to have to do backstop reference to regenerate our reference files. And while we're waiting for that, looking at this, so we have hide selectors, which will just do it'll do a hide, but kind of keep the element in place. So nothing on the page should move. It'll just like blank out that area so it doesn't affect the test. Versus remove selectors, which removes the code and everything moves to account for that thing missing from the page at that point. So I've found hide selectors to be a little bit better, but sometimes you just need to remove something for other reasons. Cool, so that completed. So backstop test now. So again, with that scenario, that random happenstance situation where my slides were different, all that I did was go into this backstop.json file, define my live slides versus my local slides. It did a test. So I didn't have to set up a brand new project or do anything fancy. You don't have to use it for a website. You can use it for anything. But as you can see, we hid that slideshow element at the very top. And, I forgot to add the hide element for the second scenario. But for the first one, it's not there anymore. Question?
Is the setup basically the same when you're running it with CI?
Is the setup same when you're running it on CI?
Or do you have to set the scenarios like somewhere else?
It's pretty much the same thing. Yeah, it depends on exactly what you want it to do. You're able to set up your backstop.json file so you can pass through like variables. So for example, if you take a look at the code for the Node app, which you do if you follow the exercise, you actually go in and you have a separate backstop file that is like sites to be tested, and you define all of the important elements for each site in an object or an array or something. And then each of those is passed into a generic backstop.json file with variables and all those things. So depending on what it is that you want to do and how complex you want it to be, you could do other things, but it's pretty similar to this.
Okay.
Another
What's
question?
your performance hit for an extensive site with CI?
What's the performance hit for an extensive site with CI? What do you mean?
If you run a lot of tests on a site, how long do you have to wait for it to
Like performance of the site or performance of the test?
the test?
I mean, you saw, adding, it's cumulative or not exponential, but it like for each test it takes, if each test takes 5 seconds or 10 seconds, each viewport multiplies that, each scenario, so it grows pretty quickly. Yeah. And so in the interest of making it something you'll actually use and not be annoyed by, you want to keep it pretty lean. But if you have this as part of an automation step that you run every time that you do a pull request, you don't want to forget anything, and so it might run longer, but you kind of forgive it because you just make the pull request and go get some coffee, and it's not something you necessarily do every day. All right, well, thank you all very much for attending, and I hope you all have a great rest of camp.